So we have here chapter 16, Hello Class. Your professor, Daryl Lamar Fisher, is back. Now we're here to talk about the endocrine system, which is after we've finished the nervous system, which your central nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord, your peripheral nervous system, your spinal nerves, your cranial nerves control the body in one way, which control many parts of the body. You also have the endocrine system, which controls your body primarily by hormones. And we are going to talk about that kind of control, a little bit different from nervous control. The two do work together in some aspects. So it'll be interesting to sort of see this. We know that things like, for instance, your growth, we males and females develop and grow differently due to primarily the hormones that our bodies release and respond to in different ways, right? So, which is an amazing system in and of itself. How, I developed into, from a single-celled organism, in my mother's womb, and then eventually came down the birth canal and was a baby that you could hold. And, all babies kind of look fairly similar in the beginning, but then slowly, facial hair and voice changes and shapes changes, and now I am who I am today. And so these things are a lot of that's controlled by your endocrine system. And so that's why one of the reasons this is an interesting chapter that's very important in the process of human anatomy and physiology. All right, so this is the overview. So the organs of this complex system work by synthesizing and secreting chemical messengers known as hormones. Hormones will react with a specific target cell, bones, muscle, different heart, different organs in the body, and they can do different things: maintain fluid, electrolyte, acid-base homeostasis, promote growth, regulate reactions. Right? Hormones play different roles, different parts of the body, which we're going to talk about in this chapter. This is just comparing the endocrine and nervous system. Remember, the nervous system sort of directly affects target cells. The nervous system, you send a signal from the brain through the spinal cord, through the peripheral nervous system, and it reaches its target cell and sends a signal, which is usually a quick, fast signal that is short-lived. Hormones, a little bit different. They release the endocrine system, they release their hormones into the bloodstream, and those hormones travel in the bloodstream to reach their target cell, which could be far from the actual gland that released the hormone. And, this could be a process that could last seconds, hours, or days. For instance, like I talked about growth, that could last, the growing process lasts a long time. So hormones like testosterone can be in your bloodstream for a significant period of time and play a significant role over the course of many days. And this is just a diagram showing endocrine versus the nervous system. Right, so we're going to talk about hormones released into the bloodstream, secreted into the interstitial fluid, after which they are diffused into blood capillaries. Blood transports hormones to the heart through the veins. After leaving the heart, the blood transports the hormones to the rest of the body, so that those hormones, once you learn about the circulatory system, we'll learn about that whole process, how blood circulates to the body. And then once it gets to the capillary beds, hormones diffuse out of the blood into the interstitial fluid and bind to receptors in their target cell. And that's a pretty interesting process how, you know, a gland here can distribute hormones into my blood and affect somewhere totally different part of my body, but those hormones bind to a specific receptor, either on the surface or inside the cell. And so they, even though they may be, the hormones may be created somewhere totally separate from where they're supposed to play an effect, they only bind to specific receptors. And so even though it's traveling through the bloodstream and could potentially go many different places, it ends up where it's supposed to, because your body has receptors that are supposed to receive it, which we'll talk about that whole process. But that's the sort of the magic of the endocrine system. Right, we have so paracrine and autocrine signals. Hormones and neurotransmitters represent a few chemical signals. Hormones are what we're going to focus on in this chapter. Hormones are secreted into the blood to affect the distant target, right? And known as the classic endocrine signal. But you also have paracrine signals, chemicals secreted by cells that affect nearby but different types of cells. And you have autocrine, chemicals secreted by cells that elicit effects from the same cell or cell type. Right? So there's different ways, but we're focusing primarily on the hormones. You know, chemicals secreted into the blood to affect the target cell that's somewhere a different part of the body. Right, this diagram just kind of shows you the difference between endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine. So your endocrine glands, diverse group of organs throughout the body, all regulate other cell types by producing and secreting hormones, right? So they secrete the hormones, hormones go into the bloodstream and affect other target cells. Ductless glandular epithelial cells secrete hormones into extracellular fluid for transport by bloodstream. Right? And you have two groups of organs, primary organs, which have only endocrine function, so basically only secrete hormones. And then you have secondary organs, which have both endocrine, they secrete hormones, and non-endocrine functions. For instance, the heart. Okay, we'll talk about that. It's on the slide coming up. Right, so your primary endocrine organs, notice they're in red. I want you to pay attention to all of those, know where they are in the body, and we're going to have to, and that's basically what we're studying in this chapter, right? So anterior pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, endocrine, pancreas, and thymus. All right, so know where those are located in the body, and I'm gonna want you to know, some idea of what each one secretes, the hormone that they secrete. Secondary organs are heart, kidneys, small intestines, testes, and ovaries. Obviously, the kidneys and the heart do other things. The heart pumps blood, kidneys create urine, small intestines help digest our food, but they also have an endocrine function as well. And then you also have neuroendocrine organs, which have a nervous system function and an endocrine function. Hypothalamus and pineal gland in the brain, adrenal medulla, core of adrenal gland, right? Consists of nervous tissue that secretes chemicals that act as hormones, neurohormones. Okay. This is a diagram showing you the location of these endocrine glands. Primary and secondary organs. Know those locations. All right, so there's two classes of hormones, amino acid and steroid. Amino acids, generally hydrophilic, bind to the plasma membrane receptors. Steroid hormones derived from cholesterol, generally hydrophobic, bind to receptors in the cytosol nucleus. So one hydrophilic tends to bind to receptors on the plasma membrane. Remember the plasma membrane. Remember your cell structure, plasma membrane, cytosol, nucleus, right? So binds to a receptor on the outside of the cell. Steroid hormones derived from cholesterol, hydrophobic. That means they don't like water, hydrophobic, binds to receptors in the cytosol or the nucleus. So it passes through the plasma membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, into the cytosol or the nucleus to bind to a receptor and affect it that way. Right, so hormone transport through blood. Remember, hormones, chemicals released by endocrine glands that are transported through the blood to affect their target cell. Right, so you have free hormones, which are the amino acid based hormones, which are the hydrophilic hormones, able to freely associate with water, travel through the blood. Then you have bound hormones, which form complexes with binding proteins in plasma. These are usually the hydrophobic, usually the steroid hormones. So they do not associate with in the plasma. Okay, so your amino acid hormones tend to be your free hormones. Your steroid hormones tend to be your bound hormones, right? Have to bind to a plasma protein carrier to travel through blood. Right, then we have where can I put myself? Okay. Target cells and receptors. Hormones are able to affect only particular target cells. Remember, I talked about that, which contain protein receptors with the hormone bind. So the hormones travel through the body, travel through the bloodstream, and they bind to a receptor at the target cell. That's how they know, obviously they pass by millions of cells from the gland that they're secreted from to the bloodstream to, the different tissues in the body. But they are only supposed to connect with a certain type of cell or cells. And so they bind to certain types of receptors. That's how they do that. So the receptors are three-dimensional, shapes highly specific for a hormone. They're either embedded in the plasma membrane if it's a hydrophilic hormone, hydrophilic amino acid type hormone, or in the cytosol nucleus if it's a steroid hydrophobic hormone. And so your body can change the number of receptors that it displays on the cell, which is another cool process, upregulation and downregulation. So upregulation means basically, this hormone is in the bloodstream, the cell detects it. I want more of this hormone to be able to generate some specific type of response. Let me display more receptors. That's upregulation. And then you have what we call downregulation. The effect that the hormone has, is supposed to do has happened. It's happened for a while. We need it to now slow down or stop. Cells can display less receptors on their surface or on the surface or in their cytosol nucleus, and therefore less hormones can bind to the cell receptors. Less hormones will have an effect on cells. And so like the hormone becomes inactive, so to speak, or less ineffective would be the better word. So that would be downregulation. Okay, so your body can control not only the release of the hormone, but then how many, the cells can control how much they're going to respond to the hormone. Obviously, the more receptors for that hormone to bind to, the more effect that hormone will have. Less receptors for that hormone to bind to, the less effect that hormone will have. Hydrophilic hormones, like we said, bind the receptors in target cells' plasma membrane. Hydrophobic hormones pass through the plasma membrane, bind the receptors in the cytosol nucleus. Talked about that. And this now talks about some of the mechanisms of hormone action. So what could potentially happen as far as a hormone binding, just as an example, right? So let's say a hormone binds the receptor in the plasma membrane. This activates a peripheral protein. G protein activates enzyme, and it just takes you through a process that could potentially happen that could be stimulated by a hydrophilic hormone. And that's a picture of that. So the hydrophilic hormone binds its receptor, starts a cascade of events, which eventually leads to phosphorylated proteins. Hydrophobic hormones could pass through the plasma membrane, interact with a receptor in the cytosol nucleus, form a complex with receptor, generally interacts with DNA, and change the rate of protein synthesis, for instance. Remember, DNA is coded for, protein is coded for in the DNA. And so this is an example of a hydrophobic hormone, and something that it could do. Hydrophobic hormone passes through the plasma membrane, binds with a receptor, which enters into your DNA, into your nucleus, binds to your DNA, and causes a certain protein to be transcribed and then eventually translated. A certain gene to be transcribed and then eventually translated to produce more of a certain protein, for example. All right, so those are just two examples of how a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic hormone could work. Amino acid and a steroid hormone could potentially work. So what are some effects that hormones stimulate secretion from endocrine exocrine cells? So hormones can stimulate other cells. They can activate or inhibit enzymes. Remember, enzymes are our body's catalysts. They can stimulate or inhibit mitosis. And mitosis, cell division, meiosis, open or close ion channels, gene expression, cause like certain proteins to be made more or less. So these are all actions of hormones. This slide is in here to talk about half-life and elimination. We talked about upregulation and downregulation, but we also have, just because hormones are chemicals, they can naturally degrade, right? So you see here in the middle of the slide, I've highlighted the rate at which hormones are eliminated largely depends on the structure and the degree of binding to proteins. And half-life is the amount of time it takes for the plasma concentration of hormone, plasma, that's your blood plasma, concentration of hormone to reduce by half, right? So certain hormones degrade faster than others, have a shorter half-life, and some have a longer half-life. Hydrophobic hormones, steroid hormones, tend to have a longer half-life, tend to last longer, whereas hydrophilic hormones tend to have shorter half-lives, right? So just know that the hormone doesn't stay in your bloodstream forever. So it's secreted, it doesn't stay there forever. It eventually degrades, okay? What are hormones again? Very simply put, hormones are chemical messengers secreted by endocrine glands, which regulate functions of other cells. So endocrine glands secrete a hormone into the bloodstream, travels to the bloodstream, and affects the target cell, right? Hormone interactions, maintenance of homeostasis requires multiple hormones, right? It's not, your body has more than one hormone. They can have a synergistic effect. Some hormones have a synergistic effect, so multiple hormones can act on the same target cells to exert the same effect or increase the effect. You can also have hormones that have antagonist effects. So you can have one hormone that causes the protein to be made, this protein to be made more, and another hormone comes along, maybe down the line and cause that protein to be made less or to stop making that protein. So you can have hormones that sort of antagonize each other, work in opposite directions, and you can have hormones that synergize, that work in the same direction. But homeostasis requires multiple hormones that interact with multiple target cells to help our body stay balanced, our homeostasis. We want our acids, we want our pH to stay balanced, we want our water levels to stay balanced, we want our temperature to stay balanced. Those are all things that are, we want to stay, temperature 98.6, pH 7.4. We want our body to maintain a certain level of water. Now, all these things are so very important. And that's called homeostasis, maintaining our body balance. These Regulation of hormone secretion. You can have hormonal stimuli. So endocrine cells can increase or decrease secretion in response to other hormones. So one hormone can cause another hormone. You can also have hormones increase. The stimulation can come from certain ions or molecules in the blood. Your body senses calcium in the blood, extra calcium in the blood. When we talk about when we get to the bone, when we get to the skeletal system, your body senses extra calcium in the blood. A process occurs to where your body wants to build more bone and therefore store that calcium, so that your body notices the level of calcium increasing in your blood. You have neural stimuli. Your body can respond to signals from your nervous system. Your hormones can be secreted based on signals from your nervous system, right? So all these can play a role in stimulating our endocrine system. The second part of this, in general, you have feedback loops which regulate your secretion, right? So this is going to be something that you're going to see kind of over and over as we describe the different functions of the different endocrine glands. But you'll see this whole feedback loop. So if you have a stimulus, for instance, like I was giving you an example of calcium. So the stimulus could be elevated levels of calcium in the bloodstream, right? So the receptor target cells, your body detects that these calcium levels have been elevated. Your control center, your endocrine cell, causes the release of a certain hormone, which we're going to talk about, thyroid, which causes a effective response. Hormone triggers a response in its target cells, causes your body to absorb calcium, therefore build more bone. Causes the osteoblasts in your bone to use that calcium to build more hydroxyapatite, which is the structure of your bone. And then as the calcium levels in your blood drop, as you return to your homeostatic range, then that hormone shuts off, and everything goes back to normal. Your body stops releasing the hormone. So you have the stimulus. This is just an example. Stimulus, your stimulus, there's extra calcium in your blood. Receptor, your body detects this extra calcium. Control center, your gland, your gland releases the hormone. Effective response, the cells in your bone absorb more calcium, build more hydroxyapatite, and then homeostatic range. So once your calcium blood levels return to normal, we stop releasing the hormone. And so it's a feedback loop like that works with a lot of systems in your body to be able to regulate your homeostasis. And this is just showing you a diagram of hormonal stimulation. So one hormone can stimulate the release of another or inhibit the release of another. You have humoral stimulation, all right, in response to a certain chemical in the blood. So glucose is another good example. Your body has extra glucose in the blood. It can respond in a certain way. Take that glucose up and store it as glycogen in your liver, for instance. And then you have neurostimulation. This is a good example we talked about with the sympathetic nervous system affecting your adrenal gland, which will release epinephrine, norepinephrine into the bloodstream, right? So adrenal gland is stimulated by your sympathetic nervous system. Right? And then we have the general feedback loop, right? So you have a stimulus, which something gets out of the homeostatic range, effective response, the receptor, control center, right? We talked about the calcium levels being too high, how your body will respond to that, and eventually get it back to normal, and eventually stop releasing the hormone that would cause your body to absorb the calcium. right? So your body notice, so the stimulus is basically when you deviate from your normal range, what you're supposed to be in. So your body knows, like for instance, how much calcium should be circulating in your blood. And so when I deviate from that range, that stimulates the body to release the hormone responsible for your bones to be able to absorb that calcium, create new bone, and until we get back to the normal range. Right? And that's section 16.1.